morning, everybody. My name is Sarah Sewell. I'm a professor of history at Virginia Wesleyan University, and I'm happy to welcome you to this third lecture in the series on the cult of domesticity in Europe. I hope you all are doing well today. They tell me it is Wednesday, April 15th, so I hope we're all on the same page. As I mentioned, this is a series on the cult of domesticity. It's about homemaking in Europe, mostly in the 19th century. And so far, we've had two lectures. The first one was on the birth of the cult of the domesticity. And then last week, we did romantic love. And today, we're going to focus on women's bodies and women's fashions with a bit of a foray into something that I'm calling the invention of the childhood. Okay, we got the right slide. All right, so we'll start with a review of last week to get everybody on the same page. Then we'll talk about the invention of childhood, and then we'll work on women's fashions and bodies. I again encourage you to send me comments or questions or just greetings. My email is ssewell@vw.edu. So if you want to have a chat, please do so. Send me an email. So let's start with a bit of a review from the previous 2 weeks. Next slide. So this is a quotation from a lawyer during the Napoleonic era, the early 19th century, and here's what he had to say. There have been many discussions on the equality and superiority of the sexes. Nothing is more useless than such disputes. Women need protection because they are weaker. Men are free because they are stronger. I think that quotation encapsulates many people's views at the beginning of the 19th century about the roles of men and women in society. Essentially, they believed that men were stronger and smarter, and therefore they needed to be public actors. Women were weaker, and they had a very important duty to do, which was to reproduce, and therefore they needed to be out of the public sphere. And so what we historians say is the world became divided into two spheres, the public sphere and the private sphere. Next slide. So in addition to politics, the public sphere also encompassed the world of business. And the beginning of the 19th century marks the start of the Industrial Revolution in the Western world. And as a consequence, we get a new class called the middle class or the bourgeoisie. And the men of the middle classes, they began to have separate business facilities. They basically had an office where their factories were, and that was in the urban area. Next slide, please. And then women of the middle classes were able to stay home. If you recall, they moved to the suburbs. They had single family homes. And there they spent an awful lot of time taking care of their household. And they were helped by a whole series of advice books telling them the ways that a good middle class woman would run their household. Next slide, please. So the woman's job of the middle classes was to create a happy home environment. And this is encapsulated very well in this drawing. You see the woman there in the front. She is doing some needlepoint. Her husband is there reading his paper and quiet. Some of the children, little children, are playing by the fireplace. And in the background, you have two older daughters who are playing the piano and probably singing. So that's the ideal family. But in addition to that, look at all of the stuff that is in that parlor. One of the woman's responsibility was to create this atmosphere and decorate their home. Next slide, please. But decorations was extended beyond the home. Women themselves, as we'll talk about in more detail, their bodies became fashioned. And here's an advertisement for a soap. And you can see this woman, she literally is all dolled up. She looks like a doll. She's wearing a corset. She has a very elegant dress on, very tight fitted. She has a fur cape on. She has a large hat on. And then in the background, this cutout looks like a Valentine's Day card. Next slide. Well, the most iconic figure of the 19th century in the Western world has to be Queen Victoria, who ruled from 1837 till 1901. This is why we call this the Victorian Era. So she came to the throne in 1837 when she was only 18 years old. 2 years later, she married her cousin, Prince Albert. And then the following year, she had a child. Altogether, she had 9 children. So she was a very strong ruler. If you don't know, Great Britain was really the most powerful country in the beginning of the 19th century. So she's ruling very solidly. But in addition to that, she becomes this iconic figure who it represents the maternal ideal for many people. Next slide. So a lot of emphasis is put on love and marriage in the 19th century in order to create a maternal ideal and to have women, particularly middle-class women, take care of this cult of domesticity. And so elaborate courting rituals, just like there's so many rituals for running your home, there's also lots of rituals and advice books for how people court. And so you have to follow those rules. Next slide. If you're from the aristocracy or the upper middle classes, one of the most important rituals is the debutante ball. Debutante balls took off in the 19th century, and basically they were a chance for women who were deemed adults at that time to go out and let everybody know that they are ready for marriage. So you would have oftentimes the first ball at the king or the queen's palace. And then after that, there was a whole season of balls. There were also like tea parties and dinners where young men and women had a chance to meet. And if everything worked really well, by the end of the season, you would be engaged. Next slide. To help this romantic love along, we have the invention of Valentine's Day. Valentine's Day's origins are obscure. We can point to lots of things going back to ancient Rome. We can point to Saint Valentine, although some believe that there were up to 3 Saint Valentines. But by the 19th century, with this emphasis on courting and love and romantic love and marrying for companionship, Valentine's Day takes off and it becomes above all a commercial enterprise. And so it really, like in the 18th century, when people celebrated Valentine's Day, it was about mainly writing love letters or making a homemade gift. But by the 19th century, industrialization steps in and it becomes a commercial enterprise. And certainly one of the most popular items to buy are greeting cards, Valentine's Day greeting cards that were generally sent anonymously. And so part of the game was to figure out who sent the card to you. And you would send them to somebody maybe you had affection for, but increasingly you also send it to friends and families and relatives. Next slide. So as I said, if everything goes well, you ended up with a proposal. And once again, the proposal and the engagement had a whole series of rules that people had to abide by. Next slide. And then it culminated in a wedding. Here is a photograph from Queen Victoria's wedding in 1840. And it was described this way by the Times. The Queen is fortunate enough to wed the prince of her own voluntary choice, the man of her unprompted affections. And I think this is a really important quotation because what we're seeing is a change in the idea of marriage by the 19th century. Previously, particularly for the aristocracy, marriage was about securing dynasties. Okay, you didn't marry for love. Love happened outside of the marriage. By the time we get to the 18th century, there's a lot of emphasis also placed on marrying from your class to secure your wealth. And certainly in the 19th century, the middle classes wanted to marry somebody from their class or above in order to secure their wealth. So definitely the question of social standing and wealth still play a role in the institution of marriage. But as I said, in the 19th century, people wanted to marry for companionship, and love was to happen in the marriage, not outside of the marriage. And that it really is kind of a new phenomenon, particularly for the upper classes in the 19th century. Next slide. So after the marriage happened, obviously the woman goes to live with her new husband. And that's what you see in this painting of Changing Homes from 1862. So if you were from the middle classes, especially, the man had to demonstrate in order to get married that he had enough wealth to take care of his wife and his family. So men had to work for quite a few years in order to gather that wealth to take care of their family. But now the bride is about to go to her new home. Next slide. And if everything worked really well, very quickly, she would have a child. In fact, Queen Elizabeth has a child within a year, her first child within a year of being married. Here's one quotation from the time about this notion of motherhood. There is no love so forcible as a love and an affectionate mother to her natural child. I think that quotation encapsulates this idealization of motherhood in Victorian England. For many people, in their view, women's highest achievement was motherhood, and they were expected to marry. As I said, Queen Victoria, she becomes a model with her 9 children. That she becomes this great mother, but she also becomes someone who demonstrates marital stability and domestic virtue. Lots of people believe that this motherhood was kind of a spiritual calling, that by fulfilling this duty, women would be transformed spiritually and emotionally. And so there was nothing that affirmed their identity more than having a child. And those poor women who failed to have children, they were deemed a failure in society. So one of the things that I want you to take away from this is the idea of having a child is not merely a biological function or a social function. And when I say a social function, what I mean by that is it's not merely to secure the family or part of the family. Okay, it also has very deep cultural and symbolic meaning. And so there's tons of rituals associated with motherhood. There's a belief that it's a sweet vocation and that middle-class women would fulfill their ideal by having children. Next slide. And Andrew Holliday had this to say: maternal love is a mystery which human reason can never fathom. It is altogether above reason. It is a holy passion in which all others are absorbed and lost. It is a sacred flame on the altar of the heart, which is never quenched. I think this quotation sort of really drives at this idea that women are fulfilled by having children, and that this bond between the child and the mother is sacred, and nothing else in life could provide that kind of solace. Next slide. So Queen Victoria's first child was Victoria Adeline Marie Louisa, who was born, as I said, it was in December 1840. So it's like really literally, I think she became pregnant 1 month after she got married. So she got married in February, pregnant in March, and then had the child in about December. What did she have to say? This day last year, I was an unmarried girl. And this year I have an angelic husband and a dear little girl, 5 weeks old. And so you see, with quotations like that, utterances like that, she is not only reaffirming her role as wife, but also as mother, as bringing the greatest joy. Now, if you read her diaries, you can also find lots of quotations where she expresses skepticism and laments the fact that she had children so early and she had so many children. But in a lot of her public utterances, she did sort of express this domestic love, this domestic harmony, and that's why she becomes the model. Next slide. So this is what the middle classes are aiming for, okay? What you have here is an engraving of a mother and child. It looks like, the mother maybe had just read a bedtime story to the child, and the child has fallen asleep in her arms. That is the ideal. But that's not the reality for lots of families in the 19th century. Next slide. So if you weren't from the middle classes, your children worked. Okay. Now, work was not a new phenomenon for children. Work, we look at the family unit historically, particularly a peasant family set in an agricultural setting. Child labor was common. Kids participated in the family enterprise of farming. So this idea that children don't work, that is a 19th century ideal. Okay. It is not one that historically is sustained. So essentially what you have with industrialization beginning in the 19th century is people take those family units that live in the countryside and they migrate to the cities. And the family functions sort of the same in that just as children worked on the farm, now they work as a family unit in the factory. So the beginning of the 19th century, the beginning of industrialization, particularly in Britain, there is a lot of child labor. And I'm sure, back in the day in school, you studied industrialization and heard about the horrific stories of child labor. Those were all true for the first phase of industrialization in the beginning to the mid 19th century, particularly in places like the United States, Britain, France, Belgium. So children worked in these areas, and manufacturers would say, well, children have advantages over adults. One of the things that children can do is, they're small, and so they can get into spaces that maybe the adult can't. And so here you see these little kids, I don't know if they're like repairing or what exactly what they're doing, maybe stocking these machines, but they can crawl up on those machines. So children as young as 7 worked in factories up to 12 to 15 hours a day, and that was 6 days a week. And they were subjected to very, very strict discipline, including corporal punishment if they didn't perform their duties satisfactorily. And this will continue well into the industrial era. Now, during industrialization, particularly the first phases, people believed in capitalism, laissez-faire economics, free enterprise. And what is that? What did that mean? That meant that there were very few regulations on employers in regards to labor. And so one of the big problems we have with industrialization, the first phase of industrialization, is that lots of people got injured. Okay, lots of injuries for these children. So they're filled with, lots of them have deformities, and then also there's an awful lot of pollutants. They're breathing in noxious fumes, which is very deleterious to their health. Next slide. Children were especially preferred in the mining industry. They could crawl into shafts that were small that adults couldn't fit into. And the thing about mining is in some of the areas at times of the years, it could be very, very hot. And so if you're a child in a very small shaft, a lot of times you dismantled because it was just so hot. And so here you can see a young woman, and she's literally got a cart of coal tied to her back, and she's trying to walk up this shaft to extract it. You might recall that one of the things I mentioned was in regards to death rates and disease is that in the 1840s in Britain, the legislators did a number of inquiries into the social situations. And one of the things they did is they looked at labor and they looked at child labor, and they put out reports. And here's a quotation from one report from 1842. One of the most disgusting sights I have ever seen was that of young females dressed like boys in trousers, crawling on all fours with belts around their waists and chains passing between their legs. So when these legislators went to the mines and saw the child labor, they were literally outraged. But, it always sort of strikes me about their reports is, yeah, they didn't really think it was a good idea that children worked, particularly young children worked in such harsh conditions. But they were more outraged by what they saw as, sort of the moral failings. The idea that a girl is not acting like a girl should be because she's carrying coal literally on her back, or she's dismantling, or the boys are dismantling. So the reports, and you read the reports, they're more outraged by what they see as sort of moral failings than the fact that these children are working. Next slide. As I said, you know, the first phase of industrialization was really difficult on people's bodies, between the noxious fumes and then just all of the injuries. There were lots of people who had deformities in the 19th century. Okay, this is the stuff of circus shows. Okay, and it is a direct result of industrialization and poor medicine. So visually, the city looked really different in the 19th century. People saw lots of people with disabilities. They were just ubiquitous. And here you see a photograph from a children's home, and you see all these boys, and they're missing legs. Looks like most of them are missing legs. And so it was this kind of phenomena that encouraged legislators to pass laws to regulate the factories and regulate Child Labor Act. The Watershed Moment comes in 1833 with the first factory act in Britain. What did this legislate? Children who were under 9 years old could not work. From 9 to 13, a maximum of 9 hours, and older children then a maximum of 12 hours. That was the first act. And then in the 1840s, they would have other acts, so that by 1847, if you were 14 to 18 years old, you could only work 10 hours. Might not seem great, but it was a huge step forward. And what did that mean? Next slide. Children weren't working, or were working less. And what did they do? And so what I talk about is something called the invention of childhood. If previously you just saw a young person as someone who worked, then you don't really think of that time when they're young as a separate phase in their lives. But once they start to take the children out of the factories, and then you couple that with the middle classes engaged in this cult of domesticity, you have the invention of childhood. What does that mean? It's the notion that there's a period in a human's life from, you know, birth to an age that they say is maturity, where it is segmented, it is taken away from the other parts of their life, and it is different, and it is experienced differently. So previously, before the 19th century, most children were seen simply as economic actors, in some way little adults. But in the 19th century, they carved out a special phase in children's lives, and they put a lot of attention to it, and a host of new rituals and beliefs about childhood. And it dovetails very nicely with this cult of domesticity, because certainly one of the primary duties of these mothers is to take care of their children. Next slide. And so all of a sudden, children begin to look very differently. Okay, and here you see an ad for some cookies, some biscuits. And there she is, and she's got her golden locks, and she's in a nice dress, and she's, you know, a child who's going to have some biscuits during her free time. She is not in the factories. So in this invention of childhood, mothers had key roles. Above all, they had to provide their children with a moral, ethical education. But what else would children do if they weren't working? Well, we have this notion of play, lots of emphasis on play. The 19th century is the heyday for the birth of children's literature. Essentially, people like Hans Christian Andersen, the Grimm's brother, they took all these old folk tales and they wrote them down and they published them in books, and these were read to children by their mothers. So all of a sudden, this bed story ritual becomes a new phenomena and gives a chance for the mother and child to bond. Certainly part of this invention of child was the notion that the children are not at work. What should they be doing? Well, they should be educated. In the Western world, we have the birth of public education by the end of the 19th century. So it becomes mandatory and compulsory. The other aspect that I'd like to talk about of childhood is that in order to sort of fulfill this ideal of a child, you had to consume things. So parents had to buy things for their children that marked this period, the special period in their lives. So next slide. So here you see a toy clown, okay? It is a toy France, it's about 1880. And so one of the things that I want to emphasize is prior to the 19th century, if children had toys, they were usually handmade. But now you fold industrialization into this phenomena, and all of a sudden toys become mass produced. When we think about industrialization, when we think about in the beginning of the 19th century, it is focused on heavy industry, things like coal, coal extraction, railroads, trains. We also definitely think about cotton. The cotton industry really took off with industrialization. So early 19th century, most of industrialization, in addition to cotton, is focused on heavy industry. But when you get to the second half of the 19th century, these countries that were industrializing began to focus on consumer goods, the kinds of things that people want. And as a result, all of a sudden, industrialization brings about the production of toys. Next slide. Certainly every girl needs a doll. Here you see some French dolls, and next slide. And every doll needs a doll house. So much of this is mass produced, and it gives children something to do. They are to play, again, segmenting off a certain part of their life as something special and different. Next slide. So with industrialization, not only did new products appear, new toys for children, but children were also used in advertising. And so here is an advertisement for a cream for rheumatism, and they're putting it on the leg of the horse. But what's interesting to me is that what you see is you see children playing. That's what children are supposed to do now with Invention of Childhood, and they have toys. They also, their clothes kind of set them apart from adults, as we will see even more as I go on. Next slide. So advertisers, they use toys to get people to buy lots of things. So here is an advertisement for soap. But what is interesting to me is that in this advertisement, you can get play paper dolls, so things that you can cut out and play with. So if you can't afford a fancy rocking horse, you could at least maybe buy the soap and also get the paper toys. So it's kind of equivalent to McDonald's Happy Meals, something really aimed at children and give them a toy. Next slide. And so then all of a sudden you have toy stores blossoming all over the Western world, and they're filled with goods. And here you see these children with their grandfather going into the toy store to buy things. Next slide. I'm sure if many of you look back in the history of your family, you have a photograph that looks something like this. By the end of the 19th century, middle-class families made a point of having family photographs done. Photography itself really is invented in the 1840s. By the end of the 19th century, it becomes mainstream. So getting a photograph of your family is a very important ritual for lots of families, particularly from the middle classes. And so here you have like a mother and a husband, and they have 2, 4, 6 children. So they are fulfilling the ideal. I just found this on the internet. This is no one special. It looks like I actually even know the name of the family. What I'm interested in is how these children are posed in this picture. So they're all dressed up in clothing that marks them as children. If you look on the left-hand side, the boy in front, he's wearing kind of a sailor uniform. That became one of the most ubiquitous children's outfits for boys at the end of the 19th, at the beginning of the 20th century. So he's playing a little soldier, a little sailor. The girls, most of them are in white and all sort of dressed up in frilly stuff, except the older daughter, who now looks, she's in a darker clothes, maybe even black, because that is sort of marking a transition from this young childhood to being a teenager. And so, why would this family get this portrait? One could make an argument that is to mark posterity, certainly, but I would also say that these children, they're on show. They're being showcased in this photograph. And so increasingly, children became a status symbol, particularly in middle classes middle class families. And they use their children to show their status. So the clothing becomes really important. In some ways, these children get dressed up just like dolls. And so in order to show your status, in order to show your privilege, you had to consume goods. Next slide. So I don't know a lot about this photograph, but I love it because here are two boys from about 1850 and they're dressed up in matching outfits. I mean, think how many children you have seen in your lifetime who are dressed in matching outfits. I mean, and they don't appear to be twins. One, they don't look exactly alike, and one appears to be older. But they are fashioned in a certain way by the mother to make them look, sort of respectable and to represent the family. Next slide. So we have this invention of childhood. We've now segmented a part of a human's life off and said, this is different. This is different than adulthood. Let's increasingly take them out of labor. Let's dress them different. Let's give them something to do. Let's get them playing. Let's buy things to help them play, and let's put them into public education. And the mother will supervise all of this. Well, children need holidays. And certainly we see the birth of modern Christmas with the 19th century. Lots and lots of family holidays come into being the way we know them today in the course of the 19th century. And certainly among the most popular were Christmas and then also the children's birthdays. And so lots of rituals and associated with these new holidays, and so many of them involve gift giving. Well, what is gift gifting? It's consumption. Industrialization is producing these goods that now a family can buy and give to their children. So Christmas has long origins, at least going back in terms of how we think about it today, going back to the 17th century when Sweden imported it to Germany. Next slide. But in the course of the 19th century, it becomes a holiday for children, emblematic of this notion of the invention of childhood. Next slide. Christmas had a whole host of rituals associated with it. And once again, we return to our queen, Queen Victoria. What did she do? Well, she put a Christmas tree in her house. And that became all of a sudden all of the rage for everybody. So her husband, German born, he brings this idea of a Christmas tree. She celebrates it. This image right here from 1848, this is one of the most popular images from Victorian England. And when she put a Christmas tree in her house, then you can imagine all the others did as well. And so here you can see her with her husband surrounded by 4 children. Next slide. I love this photograph. So here you see this young girl, and Father Christmas or Santa Claus is coming. He has a tree and he has a bag of gifts, it looks like, with her. Okay. So again, we can go back to about the 4th century to find the person who was Saint Nicholas. He was a Greek bishop from a Roman province, and he became what we came to know as Santa Claus. Okay. By the time we get to the 19th century, he becomes a mainstay of Christmas celebrations. And the writer George Sand, in her History of My Life, described her experience with Father Christmas. Here's what she had to say. What I have not forgotten is my Father Christmas. A kindly old man with a white beard came down the chimney at midnight and left a gift for me in my slipper, which I was supposed to find in the morning. Midnight, that fantastic hour of which children know nothing, which they are told is so late that they cannot possibly stay awake that long. What incredible efforts I made not to fall asleep before the little old man appeared. I was very eager to see him, but also afraid. Yet I never could stay awake that long, and the next day my eyes went straight to my slipper on the edge of the hearth. What emotion I felt at the sight of the white paper, for Father Christmas was extremely neat and never failed to wrap his present with great care. I ran barefoot to take possession of my treasure. It was never a magnificent gift, for we were not wealthy, but a cookie or an orange or simply a nice red apple. yet it seemed so precious to me that I scarcely dared to eat it. So George's son, not coming from a wealthy family, maybe got a piece of fruit for Christmas. Next slide. But by the end of the 19th century, Christmas certainly is a commercial enterprise, as you can see in this advertisement for chocolates. There is Santa Claus in a car, and it has a buggy that is absolutely filled with toys and chocolates. Next slide. And to help along, the department stores began to put out catalogs, Christmas catalog, toy catalogs, so children can sort of see what was all available, and you could even begin to mail order some of this stuff by the beginning of the 20th century. So I think back to when I was a kid and the Sears Christmas catalog came out, and my brother and I, we would run and we would take it and we would circle all the things that we wanted. This was sort of the beginning of that kind of story. Next slide. Okay, so, what I have proposed to you so far is that this cult of domesticity rested on this maternal ideal whereby women were to take care of their home and their family. And in the family, they were to have lots of children. And that was the highest calling for them, particularly for the middle classes. But the thing about it is if you're furnishing your house for the child, if you're buying pretty fancy clothes for the children, if you're buying lots of toys and you're sending them to a private school, that becomes expensive. And so there's an irony that runs throughout this. On the one hand, there's lots of emphasis put in the media in families to have children. But on the other hand, these children are expensive, and so people begin to limit the size of their family. So there's this sort of tension about whether or not to have children. And we begin to see family sizes in the Western world decline by the end of the 19th century. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that these children are now something different, and they are expensive. Next slide. Next slide. Okay. So let's switch gears and talk about women some more, and particularly their fashion. I think I have shown you this painting before. It is a painting of Napoleon Bonaparte's first wife, Empress Josephine. And what I find interesting about this painting is she is dressed in the fashion of the day. So with the French Revolution and the American Revolution, women's fashions changed significantly. Previously, when we had aristocrats in charge, they were very elaborate clothing, corsets, fancy fabrics, lots of jewelry, powdered hair, big hairstyles. And some of you might recall that during the French Revolution, people had concerns about the dress of the aristocracy. They literally thought that the aristocracy was hiding behind all of these clothes and powdered wigs and whatnot. So with these revolutions in favor of democracy, clothing changed. And they looked back to ancient Rome, ancient Greece, the first democracies, and they said, let's emulate that clothing. And so what did that mean for women's fashion? Could you put the slide back up? And then all of a sudden, like a lot of the corsets went away. The dresses looked more kind of like robes or ancient gowns. You can see her hair is not powdered whatsoever. And so it's very much simplified clothing compared to what happened previously. But that is going to change an awful lot in the course of the 19th century. So next slide. So here is an engraving of French fashion from 1827. You can all of a sudden see that more elaborate, ornate clothing comes back. The loose-fitting kind of robe gown of democracy movement changes into one that is corseted and tight-waisted, and obviously there is a large bonnet on this woman's head. So in this cult of domesticity, there's a lot of emphasis placed on women and women's fashions. Once again, women were representative of the family. They became status symbols, and the way they were dressed was to represent the family, and a family that was committed to this cult of domesticity. So Just like they're decorating their parlors, they're also decorating women's bodies. And all this stuff that they're putting on, the dresses, the hats, the gloves, the shoes, the jewelry, all of this is symbolic of their social function as wives and mothers and domestic managers. Next slide. So certainly in the 19th century, the notion of what a woman's body should look like changes enormously. And there is great emphasis on fashioning a body that looks like it can reproduce. So the female silhouette changed, okay, to represent this imaginary maternal ideal. What does it mean? Well, first of all, the waist. The waist becomes smaller. It's a small pinched waist. At the same time, you're wearing a corset, and the idea of the corset is to pinch the waist and then plunge out the breasts. And often the breast line was very decorated. At the same time, there was more emphasis put on the hips for childbearing. And then, as you'll see, by the end of the 19th century, they wore bustles, which made the behinds protrude. Next slide. So corsets have been around for a long time. They fall out of fashion with the rise of democratic movements, but in the 19th century, as they're trying to sort of mold these women's bodies to look like a maternal ideal, we have the corset returning with a vengeance by the 1820s. Now, when they were wearing this sort of neoclassical style that I showed you with Josephine, they did wear a corset, but it was a small corset, a short corset. By the time we get to the 1820s and 30s, the corset becomes much longer, as you can see in this illustration. So the corset would not only go up to the breast line and then go around the waist, but also extend down to the hips, as you can see. And in the original sort of manufacturing of these corsets, they were made with whale bones. So you could have 60 to 100 whale bones sewn into the corset to make your body conform to this image. And in the back, as you'll see, what you have are laces, okay? Laces that you can sort of tighten to pinch the waist. Next slide. And so here's what you're seeing going on here. This mother looks like she is sort of showing her daughter how to wear a corset and helping her get dressed. And there's some corsets in the back, so maybe she's trying to figure out which corset is the right size for her. And so, like I said, in the back there are laces. And then, so it was very difficult for a woman to get dressed by herself. She needed somebody to help her. If she did get dressed by herself, most of the descriptions are she would like lace for 15 minutes and then she would be sweating, and so she would take a break and then she'd lace again for another 15 minutes. So getting dressed was very difficult. But you need to sort of see the corsets not only as sort of a way to mold a woman's body, it's also about moral restraint. Many people in the 19th century believed that women who wore corsets were more virtuous. And if your corset was loose, you didn't have it as tight as it should be, then some people believed that was also a sign of a loose or unvirtuous woman. And so just like women had to protect themselves in the courting rituals from men who might take advantage of them, they also used dress as a way to show that they were sort of proper and virtuous. Next slide. So underneath you have a corset, but as we see in the 19th century, these dresses become so ornate. They become fuller and lots of decorations on them. You could have flounces and fringes and ribbons. The skirts themselves, they're pleated and they have lots of fabric on them. And so, you know, women wearing these, they have a corset underneath them, and then they have all these sort of frills and flounces on them. This becomes the ideal. Next slide. By the time we get to the middle of the 19th century, the crinoline becomes all of the rage. And I'm sure you all remember it from Gone with the Wind, Scarlett getting all dressed up. So these are bigger skirts, much bigger, and they stand in contrast to this tiny waist. And so the first crinolines, in order to make them be so full, uh, women wore lots and lots of petticoats. First, they started with a horsehair petticoat that was kind of stiff, and then they put all these other cotton petticoats on top of it, cotton or linen. By all accounts, they were hot, they were heavy, they were uncomfortable, and they were unhygienic. So if you can imagine in the middle of summer wearing something like this, it was pretty difficult. Next slide. Maybe the person who popularized the crinoline more than anybody was the Empress Eugène, who was the wife of Napoleon III, Louis Napoleon, in France under the Second Empire at the end of the 19th century. And here you see a very famous painting of her surrounded by her ladies in waiting from 1855, and they're all wearing the crinoline style. So she becomes all the rage in Europe. She is attributed for bringing the crinoline style to Europe, especially to England, and her dresses were replicated by lots of manufacturers and became quite popularized during the time when she reigned. Next slide. So here you see sort of a relatively ordinary woman. She's a Swedish woman with her dog in a photograph, and she's wearing the crinoline style. Next slide. So she is probably wearing this, okay? As I said, if you had all the horsehair petticoat topped by a bunch of other petticoats, it became very hot, uncomfortable to move around in. And so in 1856, the steel hoop cage crinoline was patented, and that's what you see here. So it's this kind of a steel cage that women put under their clothes, and so they can get rid of all those petticoats. You know, maybe at a first glance, it seems outrageous that women would wear this, but it actually kind of liberated them because they could move more freely underneath this steel petticoat. And one of the things about it is this is something that could be mass produced. So for example, in New York City, one manufacturer, Douglas and Sherwood's hoop skirt factory, produced almost 200,000 hoop skirts every single day. So lots of women are wearing them. Next slide. Just because they're wearing these petticoats and crinoline style steel cages doesn't mean they do away with the corset. The corset continues to be important, and it is coupled with the steel cages. Next slide. And so this crinoline style, it became all the rage. There's a very famous satirical magazine put out in Britain called Punch. I'm going to read some quotes from you, buy it. But this is what they had to say about this crinoline style, which they call Crinoline Mania. Okay, Crinoline Mania may be said to be essentially a female complaint, although many of the other sex, husbands in particular, are continually complaining about it. That crinoline mania is a foreign origin. Dr. Punch considers there is little room for doubt. Indeed, if he were called upon to fix the spot precisely where the malady broke out, without hesitation, he would point to Paris. Dr. Punch has ample grounds for his belief that the persons first affected were the ladies attached to the imperial court. This is Napoleon III's court. And it is a more than mere surmise with him that symptoms of this mania were primarily betrayed by the young and lovely Empress Eugène. So lots of complaints about the crinoline, mainly by men, because it's kind of difficult to move when these women have all these large hoop skirts. Next slide. So the satirists had a field day with the crinoline, and here you can see an engraving where it's called Crinoline Prevents a Kiss, and so it's difficult to kiss your beloved when she is wearing that dress. Next slide. Here you see one where the crinoline, if you can see, it is on fire. Thousands of women died from their skirts catching on fire from like fireplaces. They just sort of walk by and all of a sudden their skirt caught on fire. These large skirts would also get caught in machinery, carriage wheels, so a lot of people saw them as dangerous. Next slide. And that's what you see in this lithograph called Crinoline Difficulties, whereby a woman looks like a woman who was trying to get onto the streetcar, and her dress got caught and she fell. And so you can see the exposed, caged crinoline there in the lithograph. Next slide. So there's a reaction against the crinolines. By 1866, they fall out of fashion. And maybe the person who wore them most, Queen Victoria, is the one who brought this about. So in 1858, her daughter is getting married at the Royal Chapel in the St. James Palace. And they're afraid that if everybody, all the invitees come, then there's not going to be enough room because the women's skirts are too big. So it is alleged that Queen Victoria said, hey, you need to not wear your crinolines. And so as a result of that, Punch made some new verses to God Save the Queen. And this is what they were singing. Long live our gracious queen who won't wear the crinoline. Long live the queen, may her example spread. Broad skirts be narrowed, long trades be shortened, long live the queen. May dresses flaunting wide, fine figures cease to hide, let feet be seen. Girls to good taste return, Paris flash modes unlearned. No more catch fire and burn, thanks to the queen. So there's a reaction against that style. Next slide. So excuse me. So by the time we get to the 1880s, the crinoline is totally out of fashion. But that doesn't mean that the corset goes away or fancy dresses goes away. Here you see a fashion plate of women, and looks like they're going to some kind of ball. And increasingly, there's lots of emphasis, particularly put on girls, to wear the corset. And so, for example, in England, one boarding school, the girls nicknamed Whalebone House Establishment, because they had to wear a corset all day long, even at night, and they were only allowed to take it off one time for 1 hour a week, whereby when they bathed. So you're wearing a corset constantly. Next slide. And so, you know, as you go throughout the 19th century, these corsets change. They become longer. They become more reinforced. They use some industrial materials in them. And the advertisers sell them. And so there's lots of emphasis placed that everybody can have a corset. Next slide. By the end of the 19th century, this idea of sort of wide hips change, and there's emphasis put on women's behinds, and you have something called the bustle with a protruding behind. Next slide. And here you can see what a bustle looked like. So it was this apparatus that you put on that would hold lots of fabric that was in the back of your dress. Next slide. In my view, all of this culminates in something known as the Gibson Girls. So Charles Dana Gibson, he was an illustrator for Life magazine, and he had a fantasy of what a girl should look like, or what a woman should look like. And one of the things that's really interesting is he would put out these pictures, and then later he had a competition for women to step forward and say, you know, who is the Gibson girl? And this gal, Camelia Clifford, she sort of became the it girl of the time. And you can see what she's wearing there. And she becomes sort of the embodiment of femininity by the turn of the 20th century. She reminds me a lot of Hello Dolly. So I'm sure many of you have seen the play or the movie of it. And you know, that's what was popular at that time. Next slide. And so, of course, the corset reshapes the body. Okay. And lots of people thought that it was a beautiful thing. It was a beautiful silhouette. English Women's Domestic magazine had this to say: everyone must admit that a slender waist is a great acquisition. The so-called evil of tight lacing is so much cant. Cant means basically hypocritical. To me, the sensation is superb, and I am never prouder than when I survey the fascinating undulations that art affords to nature. Next slide. Here you see a photograph of the actress Polaire, who was said to have a 15-inch waist. Nothing could be more becoming to the figure than a waist that looks infinitesimal. And so the wasp waist became very popular at the time. And in order to get that, you had to wear a corset all the time. Next slide. The English Women's Domestic Magazine had this to say: I have invariably noticed that the girls with the smallest waists are the queens of the ballrooms. So lots of emphasis put on using the corset to make the waist become smaller and smaller. Next slide. So here you see a cartoon of corset tightening. So this is this sort of tight lace, taking this lace and getting it tighter and tighter. What we believe that if a woman was wearing a corset, the average waist size in the 19th century was 23 inches to 31 inches. But for lots of girls, women, what they wanted to do was marry before they're 21. And when they got married, on the day of their marriage, their waist was not to exceed their age, which was 21. Some women claim to have waists as small as 13 inches, but when we look at the dresses and the corsets, it's about 20 inches. Very, very few people had less than 20-inch waists. Well, mothers, part of their responsibility, sorry, next slide. Mothers, part of their responsibility was to teach girls how to dress. So you could begin to outfitting girls and training corsets as young as 6 or 7 years old. And by the time they were 14, they graduated to a full-fledged corset. Next slide. One mother described her daughter's reaction to the corset. Here's what she had to say. My daughter wore the stays, the corset, the first night after much protestation, but on the second night, I found she had taken them off. I then took the precaution of fastening the lace in a knot at the top of the lace holes, and for a night or two, this had the desired effect. But she was not long before she cut the stay lace. I have punished her somewhat severely for her disobedience, but she declares she will bear any punishment rather than submit to the discipline of the corset. A month later, the mother reported, now her only objection is that the corsets are uncomfortable and prevent her from romping about. So you can see the mother feels this tremendous responsibility to train her daughter to wear a corset. Next slide. Here's what some men thought about corsets. One guy: I am certain that half of the charm in a small waist comes not in spite of, but on account of its being tight-laced and the uneasiness caused by the corset. So men found the corsets seductive. And it was not only the body shape that they found attractive, they also found the discipline of a woman forcing herself into a corset day after day. They found that attractive. Here's what a second man had to say. There is something to me extraordinarily fascinating that a young girl has for many years been subjected to the strictest discipline of the corset. If she has suffered, as I have no doubt she has, it must be quite made up to her by the admiration her figure excited. But there were objections to the corset. Next slide. Here is one man describing his daughters wearing corsets. My daughters are living instances of the baleful consequences of the dreadful fashion of squeezing the waist until a body resembles that of an ant. Their stays are bound with iron in the holes through which the laces are drawn, so as to bear the tremendous tugging which is intended to reduce so an important part of the human frame to a third of its natural proportions. They are unable to stand, sit, or walk as a woman used to do. To expect them to stoop would be absurd. My daughter, Margaret, made the experiment the other day. Her stays gave way with a tremendous explosion, and down she fell upon the ground. I thought she had snapped in two. My daughters are always complaining of pains in the stomach. We'll do one last slide today, and it's this one. So by the end of the 19th century, they took these corsets and they electrified them to mold the body again into this sort of silhouette, this ideal maternal silhouette. Okay. So our clock tells me that our time has expired for today. I again encourage you to send me emails SSEWELL at bwu.edu. Love to hear from you. Next week when we come back, we are going to talk about the rebels, the women who were objected to this sort of notion of the cult of domesticity and this maternal ideal. In the meantime, I wish you a healthy and safe and happy week. You take care. Bye-bye.